Hello humans, welcome to Disney's Hard Labor. This is episode 35 of your Power Report, and I'm Dan from the internet. I said in the previous episode of Power Report that I wanted to emulate what I believe leftist media should be doing more of, which is talking to workers and people who are close to striking movements and elevating their voices. And that motivated me to spend the next episode of planning the next episode of Power Report and looking for some of these voices. And so today I have a really great episode for you in that regard. Joining me on this episode, I have
Helen Silverstein. I am a member of DSA LA's Hollywood Labor Committee's leadership. I am also, through DSA LA Hollywood Labor, in charge of the Red List, a socialist scripts competition. I am also a worker in Hollywood.
You can find Helen on Twitter at IceColdHelenAid. And with her work on the leadership committee for Hollywood Labor, DSA LA's labor committee, I was sort of not expecting to have this happen in the interview, but I was seeing so many parallels with politics as it exists on a broader level, the power dynamics between the rich and powerful, the politicians who we elect to even the playing field, and how they're oftentimes playing this mediating role and in reality don't want to do what they were elected to do and supporting their constituents. The end result of pain at the labor level with the material conditions getting worse and worse for workers. Meanwhile, productivity is ever increasing. You'll sort of start to realize as we go through this interview that I am continually taken aback by how many parallels there are between the labor movement and politics more broadly. And so I try to tease that out a little bit in the interview. There's also aspects of really getting at how labor really works. I think not a lot of labor education has been done in America. And so I think Helen and myself lay down some really good facts here for you. So stay around the interview for that. But really importantly, the dynamics of what it actually takes and what you're up against when you are attempting a strike of some kind or attempting a labor movement, because on the internet, a lot has been talked about, or it's been taken for granted how difficult it actually is to build these movements over long periods of time, to the detriment of people really understanding how to build not just labor movements, but movements overall to build political power. The knowledge to understand how these fights were won in the past and how fights were lost in the past is crucial to learn right now at this juncture, when we need to best calibrate and understand how we can push the Democratic Party left to avert essential disaster. And by not learning these lessons, and by going into seductive, easy outs and, unorganized labor strikes and things like that, can be really detrimental to building left power and working against a lot of built-in cynicism that workers have on a different level. Because ultimately we're talking and we're having political conversations, and I enjoy the fact that you're listening to this political podcast, but not everyone is a political junkie, and we need to expand the universe. We need to open the conversation to people outside of politics and learn to speak the language that people outside of politics speak in order to do that. And we need to come at them with a language and analysis that allows them to understand their material conditions and why there's a place for them on the left and basically nowhere else in the current political system today. So I think that's the top level what you get from the conversation, but there's a lot of details in there. I really appreciate Helen for taking the time out and doing this. I'm going to do the plugs at the top of the show. So like I said, you can follow Helen at IceColdHelenAid on Twitter, and you can follow myself on Twitter, Dan from the Web, but you probably already know that. There are going to be a lot more ways you can interact with the show soon and kind of bring the show together. I hope to announce those very, very soon. So stay tuned for that. Make sure you're subscribed anywhere you are listening to this podcast, whether it's on YouTube at youtube.com/Dan from the internet. Hit the subscribe button. Would really appreciate it. And if you're listening to the podcast version, which is really convenient, we're at pretty much wherever you get podcasts and major podcast apps. Give us a good rating, 5 stars, thumbs up, whatever exists in that app. It helps people find the podcast. And I really appreciate it, and the future really appreciates it. Thank you, Helen, so much for joining me on the show today. I'm really excited to talk to someone who is really closely working with labor in a moment where labor is having a moment itself. And so,
It's
uh,
totally having a moment.
yeah, and I'm really happy to see it. And there's a lot to go into because, especially on the internet right now, there isn't it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, there's a lot of attention towards labor movements, and that's really great, because labor movements in general and movements for workers' rights tend to be slow. They're processes that happen over years at a time. Meanwhile, this moment, like, there's a lot of social media attention. There's a little more news attention than you'd usually get, and that's good. But on the other hand, a lot of people are sort of jumping to conclusions, like saying, okay, anyone else who hasn't directly like organized in their workplace already and hasn't spent years doing this can just find a day on October picked out by some shady group on TikTok and then just not work that day and build a worker strike that way. And that's also not good. And so, like, I think it's important, and what we'll definitely be doing in this conversation is like contextualizing what real labor organizing looks like. But I want to start by asking you directly, like, with your work in DSA LA, what does that look like when DSA is like building bridges with labor and building those relationships? And what does that look like when you get to a moment like this, where IATSE is nearing a deal, the International Association of Theater, or Theater and Stage. Do I have it right?
Got it. One more.
I'm not gonna get the last one.
It's okay.
Electricians, engineers?
I don't know. I don't
Um,
actually know. Isn't that bad?
yeah, I always just call it IATSE because that's a good
I've
thing.
always called it IOTC or the
Yeah,
I.
employees, but I think stage engineers just sounds more badass, so I might just stay with that forever. But could you explain, like, what that work looks like in building bridges between a political organization and a labor movement?
Yeah. So a big thing that I've noticed, labor is having a moment right now. Like union approval ratings are the highest they've been in decades. Major strikes are happening all over the country. Major unionization efforts are happening all over the country. And something I've noticed is that people don't inherently think of labor issues as political. And like that's something that's weird because everything has been made political in our world. Like things that shouldn't be political, like wearing a mask or vaccines, have been like, oh man, this is a right versus left issue. But a lot of older politics go back to labor issues, and a lot of what brings people over to the left goes back to labor issues. Something else I've noticed is that people don't like to think of themselves as workers and of themselves as people who are suffering under capitalism. I have a lot of friends who are in unions that have been on the brink of strikes or big movements right now who say, oh, well, so many other workers have it so much worse. And I say, we have these events in Hollywood Labor called Champagne Socialism, where we get together and we commiserate over drinks. It's a little play on the Hollywood drinks thing. We have a lot of a lot of the way business gets done in Hollywood is over drinks, and so instead we have drinks where people talk about the real situations happening in their workplace. And what happens every single meeting is someone will say, oh, wow, I don't want to share this because it's not going to sound as bad as what all of you have been through. And then they will share the most horrifying story you have ever heard. No one wants to think of themselves as directly suffering under capitalism, as directly needing a union, as directly needing people to advocate for them. It's it's easier to recognize it in others than themselves, I think.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, a lot of what DSA is doing is kind of putting terminology and putting, like, words and a sense of, like, understanding to what people are going through in their workplace, like, to be able to, yeah, like, to be able
Yeah.
to share those stories and, like, feel comfortable identifying the material conditions in which they're going through and why that doesn't have to do with, "Oh, this workplace is just particularly bad," or like, "Oh, I mean, like, probably like that is one factor, but also it's larger than one workplace. It's what a lot of other people are going through. It's a systemic thing, so to speak.
100, that's exactly what I was going to say. It's systemic. It's not something I say often is that like you can't change the system changes you, in regards to people who try and get involved with electoral politics. But like this is so deeply ingrained in our system, in our society, this the idea of hustle culture, that like people rise and grind, get that bread. It's people like have been conditioned to think that their entire life should be revolving around their work and their labor, and not that their labor is just something that they do in addition to the rest of a fulfilling life. I mean, and that goes back to this IATSE stuff. There are a lot of people who are really content with working 18-hour days and who say, well, this is the price of being in the industry that I love, but it shouldn't have to be that way.
Yeah, I think, like, especially even over lockdowns, we saw the entire economy shift and adjust to meet the conditions, that society was facing. Like, there were restrictions on where people could go because we didn't have a vaccine that now people don't wanna take for dumb reasons, against a virus that was rapidly spreading and killing a lot of people, and so, in Hollywood especially, there were for a while, things weren't being shot, but the show must go on, as is the cliche, and so, there were restrictions put in place, there were distancing measures. You couldn't shoot in as many places, but people wrote around it, they shot around it, and as a result of this, like, and I've seen this as firsthand, like, some of these people, like, they are incredible at adapting to the situation and getting the job done, but that involves work. That involves additional work than what is normally done to reinvent the wheel and do all these processes, and that's hours, that's time, and when the entertainment industry is working on, like, razor thin budgets to begin with and, like, razor thin, time constraints to begin with, it's just that much harder to do the job, and then there's no respect that kinda comes after that, like, "Hey, thank you for doing this job under insane conditions." You get nothing.
And like that brings up something else I'd like to mention in regards to the proposed agreement for IATSE. Everyone keeps on talking about inflation and how like, okay, this 3% increase, it doesn't match with inflation. Or there are people who are very in support of the contract who say we don't want to tie it to inflation in case inflation goes down. But it shouldn't be all about inflation. Productivity has grown exponentially over the last years and it shows no sign of slowing. It As more time goes on, film is a complicated industry, but people get better and better at these things. There are people entering the film industry for the first time ever who are already better at their jobs, better prepared, better trained, better at dealing with complex issues than veterans leaving the industry. I mean, they deserve to be compensated appropriately because profits for those at the top have also grown exponentially. And it's COVID really showed us like film workers are amazing. We can adapt to anything. The show I'm on, its last season was entirely remote. None of the actors ever met each other. Everyone was working from their webcams, and it was still a great series of television. People have been we've had to adapt this season to having fewer actors in the room with each other. Just people in this industry are brilliant and they have done so much. And every year, everyone gets better at handling these complex issues, better at creating better content for everyone. It's not just like graphics and effects that look better 10 years, like 10 years ago. It's storytelling itself has gotten more complex, more precise. People are doing things with the written word that they have never done before, and people deserve to be compensated appropriately for that, because it's not just like the showrunners and the bosses at the top who are making all of these changes. It is I have friends who are writers assistants who have pitched jokes that have gone on to become internet memes and like changed the world in a little way, and they're getting paid, nothing.
That's just ridiculous. Like, it's a travesty, really, like, how we are even well, yeah, it's a systemic, and it goes not just in Hollywood too, because like, I think this conversation can seem sort of insular of like, oh, people on a screen talking about content, sure, but like, I think this is something that is felt in a number of different places, like not just on not just in the entertainment industry, but in the hospitality industry. It's been felt a lot during COVID-19. People heard a lot about like delivery workers and people working in grocery stores and on the front lines in that sense, to say nothing of doctors and things like that. But of course, all these are different situations and class levels, but a lot of these, especially like grocery workers, delivery workers, are kind of keeping society going on that level. The entertainment industry is kind of keeping society not necessarily like sane. I'm not saying like, oh, thanks to the entertainment industry, we're making everyone like lives better or anything like that. But in a way, yes, because it's like reprieve from everything that's going on. It's like just like entertainment, it's there. It's making money for a reason. To your point, like it's making more money than ever before. So it should be way past time for these companies to sort of give their due.
And I mean, like, that is a like bias we all have towards the entertainment industry, and I am so guilty of it. Like, my showrunner had to sit me down the other day. I was like, I don't have a real job, and my showrunner was like, sat me down and was like, you need to stop saying that. You have a real job. You put in the labor, you make a product, people enjoy it. Also, even if you made a product that people didn't enjoy, you are putting in the labor. Like, you are giving a part of yourself to this. Like, don't discount your efforts, which is just like, first of all, my showrunners are amazing. But also, like, there's this tendency to be like, oh, well, other people have it worse, so I don't really have it that bad. But like, the fact is, even though film is like this magical industry, people are literally dying for their art here. People are, getting sick from COVID going into work. People are putting off having children, getting getting like weird medical disabilities because they've been working on set for so long. This is work that is breaking our bodies and breaking our minds. It's still labor.
Yeah, like, and when we're talking like theater and stage technicians, like you're talking people who are holding up lights for hours and hours a day, or microphones, or all the invisible things, the theater magic. Like, it's not magic, it's labor. And I think that's equivalent to um like workers in John Deere, for example, who are striking. I was talking about doctors and people who are like in the medical field who are at like different levels of the class structure. And people always say, "Oh, doctors, they make six-figure salaries," but it's like there's more at hospitals than doctors. There's nurses, there's lab technicians, there's a whole bunch of people. And the strikes that are happening, or the proposed strikes that are happening at Kaiser Permanente, is an example of that. As I think at different points I've talked to you, Helen, about Kaiser Permanente and my annoyance with them as a company, especially on the mental health side of things and where they fall short. And what I've actually kind of found is sort of tragic is that the people I'm on the other side of the line with, who are like working through the administrative stuff, they're exhausted as well, because like they're working within a system that is not set up to meet the needs of the workers that are working there. And as a result, the workers are not able to provide the best service to the people at the end, who are like need help and whatever needs you're saying. And of course, like the danger situation when it comes to the entertainment industry and these conditions brings to mind the tragic situation that happened on the set where Alec Baldwin ended up shooting the weapon that ended up being loaded and killing the camera woman.
Yeah. And like, that is a tragic, tragic situation. But what I really hate about this situation is that the media is all trying to like blame all these like lower level support staff, and or even like leftists I know are like, oh well, this production team's fault. And it's not this one production. Like, this one production had a lot of issues, but it is emblematic of the industry as a whole. The industry's need to cut corners at every turn, the absolute lack of regard for safety of workers on sets. I mean, this is just one incident, But everyone I know who works in film is like the amount of things that had to go wrong for two people, one person to get killed, another to get injured by a gun on a set. Like that's so many rules had to be broken, but everyone knows it's not rules that were broken, it's rules that were willfully ignored so that they could cut corners. Everyone knows that there were problems on set before this happened on this production. People walked off and no one cared because it's just so common at this point. People getting tired and fed up and unable to work under ridiculous conditions. If it hadn't been this set, it could have been countless other sets I've worked on where conditions were horrible. And like a lot of this goes back to the union. There's a lot of non-unionized labor in film that should be unionized. A big effort within Hollywood labor right now is to try and hear how PAs are doing, how low level support staff in rooms are doing, because this is where a lot of the problems come from. People who aren't trained, who don't know what they're doing, and who are told, okay, well, we'll give you like whatever, we can give this person making minimum wage. They can handle the guns on set and they can handle expensive, heavy industrial equipment. Because why would we pay someone union rates for it?
Yeah, it's and then yeah, the cost cutting is so emblematic in so many industries in so many contexts that I feel like unfortunately it's a case study, it's an example of what is going on in labor more broadly. And I think there's like larger trends because in a political sense, there was a lot of talk about, um, oh, there are people who have been enjoying government benefits for too long. Like there's a whole narrative that, like, oh, all the COVID benefits that were given by Trump and then Joe Biden and Republicans and Democrats, just Washington in general, had gone on too far. And now we need to get people back to work. It was like a Republican talking point that eventually, of course, got spoon fed to centrist Democrats like Joe Biden. And then they
Yeah.
ran with this. And it became this like ultimate sort of measure that, okay, we're going to pull back on people's benefits. And that's going to make it so we have record amounts of empty job fillings. They're like places where we can hire people and people are not coming back to work. So now that we don't have these benefits going out to people, people will come back to work. And then something shocking happened, which is people weren't coming back to work. So like, and economically, this is confusing economists. And unlike I studied economics for a couple years in college. I don't consider myself to be like an economist, but they
You are.
teach you they teach you a whole I mean, basically, right? I mean, there are people who do less and call themselves like more on the internet on the left, so whatever. But like they teach you the whole gamut of things that can happen in an economic system. And one thing that can happen is uh you have a situation where you have a lot of employers who want to hire a lot of workers, and that ends up being a good thing because workers have power in that situation. It's one of the rare times where workers can exercise power because rather than um because there's so many jobs to choose from and workers have that ability to choose from jobs, they can demand more. They can demand, okay, this has to be a higher wage, this has to offer me more time off for bereavement or maternity care, paternity care, or any kind of like thing like that. And some jobs are having to step up to that. However, a lot of places are holding firm and not doing that, and they're still caught in this like old school mindset of, kind of like again what you were saying earlier. You should be happy and proud of doing this. This is hard work, but this is just the way it is. And so, how hard has it been to break some of that kind of like old dogmatic thinking, at least on your end, that like, oh, you should be proud of the almost literally backbreaking labor. And in fact, you should actually say, no, I do backbreaking labor. I should do a little bit less of it because there's so much more production or so much more money being made out of it as a result now.
I mean, a lot of this, people think that labor issues are really leftist versus conservative. But what I've noticed are the bigger issues are leftist versus neoliberal. And something going on in IATSE right now is kind of a microcosm for what's happening all over the country, in that a lot of IATSE leadership really supports the new proposed agreement and are saying, look at what we've gotten. Isn't this enough? Why aren't you happy with this? This should be enough. But they're not willing to work outside of the system. They're only looking at it within the system. They're saying, well, this is the way it's always been. These are the most gains we've ever made. And I don't want to discount the gains that they have made in this agreement. They are great. And people who are not paid for their labor did a lot of work organizing to get those gains. But at the same time, like, it's this resistance to break out of the mold that they have set for us. That you deserve more than you're getting. And they deserve more than they're getting, and they refuse to believe that. And it's kind of like, it kind of seems like a smaller scale version of what's happening right now with the Biden administration. Everyone's saying, well, Joe Biden is the most leftist president ever. I literally heard that, like, that he's the most progressive president ever because of what he's done. But this is not, people deserve more than this. It's getting rid of paid family leave. It's getting rid of healthcare for all, getting rid of all these big, lofty promises and saying, well, this is still farther than it's ever been. No, we deserve more. And like IATSE workers, a lot of the workers at the bottom, there's this disappointment with their leadership. There's this disconnect between IATSE leadership and IATSE rank and file, where when I talk to certain union members, they think, oh, because I'm in certain locals, like our concerns are not taken as seriously as bigger locals. Or, oh, because I haven't had the time to go to union meetings and town halls, my concerns have been discounted. And I don't know, it seems like an intentional effort to drive people apart so that they can't realize that we all are on the same side. It is not IATSE leadership versus IATSE rank and file. It is all of IATSE, all of Hollywood laborers versus all the people at the top. It is, the issue is not actors getting paid ridiculous amounts. The issue is people getting paid ridiculously low amounts. It breaks my mind. I really hate it. I wish everyone would understand that we are all fighting the same fight here and you all deserve more. Like, people are saying like, oh, well, this new contract, it gives us, 10-hour turnarounds. And it's like, if you have a 10-hour turnaround, if you're working 8 a.m. to, I don't know, let's say like 1 a.m., because that happens. And even if you have a 10-hour turnaround, production companies are going to squeeze as much as they can out of you. Most people can't afford to live in this city. They have 1-hour commutes. So if you're spending 10 hours working, 1 hour driving one way, 1 hour driving the other way, that leaves you 12 hours left of your life. And like your life, so you have 8 hours of sleep, 4 hours of whatever you want. Your life should be more than 4 hours of your own time. You deserve.
It's not 4 hours of your own time because like people have
my numbers were completely off, but
I mean, not even like let's take your numbers as like true, which like they are like, and like I like the example. It's not to attack the example here because like, but it was to acknowledge that sometimes there's like 16-hour working times and like turnarounds much less. But let's take that 4 hours, right? And a normal person's like 4 hours of free time, like a normal person's weekend. It's filled with chores. It's filled with like doing bills and other kinds of like machinations of capitalism that keep you away from actual free time, from actual like enriching yourself, like personally, just like enjoying life as a limited experience as people get to live it based on just like a broad general sense, not to get overly religious about it. But like there's so much that is robbed of it systemically that I think it's interesting right now that people are kind of, at least if the statistics are to be seen and like the anecdotes are to be taken seriously, people are seeming to be turning around to that. And I think like you have a really unique position within DSA like Hollywood Labor to be, and then the leadership of that to like really be able to see that happening from one like really important perspective and kind of see the nuances of that. So kind of from that, like what are some like legal hurdles and like issues that people sometimes face when they're trying to unionize, because that's a whole sort of like dynamic that the media isn't talking about as well. It's like, okay, there'll be some unionization efforts, and sometimes it'll even be seen as, oh, we're actually really sort of enjoying this, or like we really want the best for our workers, and so we encourage their efforts on bargaining, and we look forward to it. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, they're lawyering up and like hiring these teams to um basically sabotage any union effort they can, sabotage the unionization effort in any way they can. So, like, what are some of these hurdles that you've seen to some extent that you can speak to?
I mean, one big thing, I don't know if you've heard of the Taft-Hartley Act.
Very vaguely, but
Okay,
school us.
so the Taft-Hartley Act came about in 1947, and it was originally meant to like squash communist sentiment. And it's an act that was super controversial even for the time. Like it got vetoed by I think Truman, and then the veto got overridden. It and it's come up a lot in this IOTC stuff, and it's come up a lot in other unionization efforts that DSA LA has tried to help with this past few years. And like, it's it's so bad. We're literally being union efforts of today, 2021, are literally being held hostage by an over 60-year-old. Like, what is it? How long ago was 1947? 70 years ish now? We're being held hostage by a bill meant to squash communist sentiment. Um, it it's so you're not allowed to like strike in solidarity with it, which is like, okay, so you're not, so people on sets who are not in the unions are not allowed to strike. PAs are not allowed to strike, even though PAs are treated some of the worst conditions in this industry. I'm on a non-union show. No one on my show would have been allowed to strike. Um, let's see, what are the other, I could go off and off on this act. It's, you
It
have,
just go on.
sorry. I mean, Dan, you're way more educated on like everything than I am. But it's, you have to give, you have to give notice for a strike. You have to like ask for a strike under this act. Um,
And like, if
gosh,
you don't meet all of these requirements, like they will find ways to slow down the efforts and all these different things. They'll find ways, like this is a big thing with Amazon when they were having their strike. They'll find whoever's leading it and try to intimidate or harass them, and try to get them to stop leading it or participating in that effort in general. And the I almost I get at the same loss for words too, because it's like the system itself is already doing so much to bring people down on a labor basis, right? And then you get like, okay, every angle of the way. There's this angle, there's like the legal angle, there's what the work, like what the bosses are doing, playing like a good cop bad cop at the same time. And so you can sort of understand why after a while, even getting places to the point of like card check, or getting companies or organizations to the point of uh getting enough solidarity to get to the collective bargaining process, to even get to that step. A lot of people, like rank and file workers, get extremely cynical about it, almost like rightfully so, because it is such an uphill battle. But I mean, the gains are the weekend. Like, I'm laughing because I'm thinking of that one meme where the bloke from what, my brain is just conked out. But James Bond is saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, the weekend all over again." I'll be able to edit it and it'll be fine. But like the actual like 2 day weekend was a fought for by like labor. It was like an organizing measure. I've always joked that like if I ran for president of the single issue like campaign on the 3 day work week, I would sweep, because I'm sorry, on a 4 day work week. 3 day work week would be even awesome. But like the 3 day weekend and the 4 day work week, I would sweep, because that is just something that people feel will understand so like deeply, in any person who works for a living will understand so deeply, right? That we're working harder than ever. We can actually do better work if we're not just constantly working on this exhausted basis. So let's shift things around so that we can fit this new work schedule and guess what? The sun will keep rising and setting, and the days will keep happening, and the work will still keep getting done. And so I think it's important to sort of see that, yeah, these moments of striking are super rare, and they um sometimes, like, even in their best cases, often achieve like kind of marginal wins, like here and there, but they are really crucial and they are really important because in the end, it's these battles or nothing, and it's not even nothing. It's like it keeps getting worse year by year because they keep stretching and trying to get more and more out of employees.
Yeah, 100%. And something that's come up a lot in this IATSE contract negotiations, like the official IATSE like message right now is to vote yes to ratify the new contract and to avoid a strike. And something that they say is, oh, well, if we don't get a strong enough no vote, if it's a small majority, we might lose some of the gains we've made. And people don't take into account that if they get like an overwhelming yes vote to ratify this new contract in 3 years, when they go back to the table, the people at the top are going to say like, oh, well, this was enough for you 3 years ago. 98% of your members or whatever it will be agreed to ratify this new contract. So why do you want more? This is the time. They have had support like none others. And I know it is wild to watch on social media how official IATSE messaging is just like vote yes on the strike, and then all the comments will be like vote yes on, not on the strike, vote yes on the new contract. All of the comments will be like absolutely not. I don't want to do this, and this is nothing. This is not what we were promised. It's not like bloodthirsty socialists lusting over a class war. It's individual workers who don't want to be treated like this anymore, who thought that people at the top who were supporting the strike were really supporting them. It's this disconnect between, I'm someone who's very biased because I work as a writer. I was a writer's assistant up until like 2 weeks ago. And if you're a writer's assistant and you're working 20-hour days or whatever, if you end your day at 1 a.m., you close your laptop and you go to sleep. If you've been on your laptop all day, that's a different kind of labor than people who have been on sets for like 18-hour days, who are doing back-breaking work and who need more than 10-hour turnarounds to recover. 10-hour turnarounds, so what? You have every medical expert in the world says you need 8 hours of sleep a night. Everyone. This idea that 12 on, 12 off is like a new demand that I obviously never had in the books and never should have asked for is bullshit, because that should have been the minimum ask, is a 12-hour turnaround. That 10 hours is ridiculous. So if you have a 1 hour commute total, like let's say you live 30 minutes away from your work because you got that lucky, but most people, it's an hour commute each way.
Yeah, Los Angeles, it's an hour.
So you have 0 hours. You have 8 hours of sleep, 1 hour each way to work. You have 0 hours free time. Your entire life is working. That's what they want for you. You deserve more than that.
Absolutely. And so I think what we sort of illustrated here is like sort of like a broad view of like how the Hollywood labor movement sort of represents a lot of what's going on in the labor movement more broadly, but a lot of what's going on in politics. You have all of the mechanisms in place to make things better. Like all of the people in power can do the things, all of the workers want the things to happen, but the friction is the fact that there's so much concentrated benefit that can be had amongst the few like executives and higher ups, and this can be applied to politics as well, that the system stays the same. And so what you get is this like little game to where you have the unions who have this mechanism to fight for workers and oftentimes do and occasionally get very close, but when you get to these points of all right, here's the deal, oftentimes you get this sort of play folding, like okay, this is the best we've got essentially, and we should take this and be okay with it. Meanwhile, the rest of the workers are like, hey, we put a lot on the line here. Strikes often mean you're going without pay. Oftentimes people will contribute to strike pay, like a big pool of money to get people to like have some pay. That's great. That may be like $3 an hour, if that, or like $5 a day. Like it doesn't make up regular pay at all. And so there's massive sacrifices that people are going through. Again, also equivalent to politics, but elective representatives in the political sense, or like people in the union, are like union representatives in the sense, sometimes don't fight all the way for workers, or like they leave them a little bit short. And so I think that is, understanding that isn't to say, oh, there's so much working against you and it's impossible. I think it's sort of to say, this is the lay of the land, this is how things usually work. And so to break that cycle, we have to be smarter about what to expect, and like to include that with our, not just our analysis, but how we are informing other people when we are trying to encourage people in certain workplaces to like form unions or start to begin that conversation of worker power.
And I will also say something that's been brought up a lot is like, what will strikers lose if they strike? What will workers lose if they strike? What we haven't heard at all is what these big companies will lose if IATSE strikes. And I think that's really important. And I think people know those numbers. People at the top have done the cost analysis of, this is what we will lose if we strike. We need to prevent a strike. Why aren't we hearing about that? Because I think that has an astronomically high value that people don't realize. I don't know. And like, I think I have a bunch of notes here that I haven't referenced at all. So sorry for looking at my phone. It's there's just there's so many problems with this contract, in my opinion. I mean, something that came up a lot during our meetings is someone was saying that their union leadership had said to them, it's not a Christmas list. Like, you can't just ask for everything you want. But that's not the way that negotiations work. You're supposed to over ask. You wouldn't go, if it was a one-on-one meeting with your boss and you wanted a 5% raise, you wouldn't ask for a 5% raise. You'd ask for a 10% raise and watch it get probably fought down to a 2% raise, but you would ask for more than you thought you could get. They shouldn't have asked for 10-hour turnarounds. And for meal penalties to increase after the fourth meal penalty. I don't know anyone who's ever gotten to the fourth meal penalty. I know everyone who's gotten to the first and second.
Could you explain that for our like non-Hollywood audience?
Yeah, of course. So you're guaranteed meals, but if you don't get that time off to eat, it becomes a meal penalty and they just have to pay you more. But the problem is, like, people are literally dying because they can't, you need breaks to eat, you need food. Let me look at the numbers for what the meal penalty. I've been told working on sets before, I've been like, hey, you don't have any lunches built in for this 18-hour day. Is that an error? And people are like, oh no, we're just going to pay the meal penalties. That's not it. They said the quiet part out loud. You're not supposed to you're supposed to feed people. You're supposed to give people this time. It shouldn't just be, oh, well,
we can afford to just like pay the penalty of not feeding them. Let's just like shoot faster.
If it costs less to pay the penalty than it does to have people break for an hour, the penalty is not high enough. It is not doing its job.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And I think this is important. It's important behind the scenes because there's a push to approve this vote, and these things are never perfect, but a lot of times people say, don't be the perfect, be the enemy of the good. These are like, this is just, I want to eat, dog. Like, that's nothing perfect or good about that. It's just people want to eat. People need to eat to do their jobs, if you want to be like really cynical about it, but just to survive. And so I'm glad that I really appreciate you. You were saying that like, oh, I'm this like really smart person, and sure, I get told that sometimes, but like I bring people on who know and are in places and have experiences that I don't have, that people in my audience often don't have, so that we can all become smarter for it. And I really appreciate you like informing me and my audience about this whole process from the inside, especially because I mean, it's almost been a little bit depressing to see like I mean, on the one hand, of course, the American education system isn't really good about teaching about labor. So, of course, people don't have a good foundation for these things. But on the other hand, there are people who call themselves leftists who put hammer and sickle emojis in their profiles, and they are speaking very authoritatively about strikes and labor power and what we have to do and all these different strategy things. But it's like you haven't talked to a single worker offline. And so I in good faith, I want those people to understand the nuances of these conversations. They can take their energy, which I think is good, and they can direct it in a productive way. And I think like I've always say like being involved in politics locally is a better way that to be involved in politics than like freaking out about national news. And like what you're doing is a great example, being on leadership of doing that, because you actually get to like talk with workers, and in addition to living that experience, but you get to bring that experience to the political space and share that with other workers, and then use that as a bonding experience to ultimately build slightly better working conditions on the margins. And then hopefully that snowballs into just much better working conditions that can be felt across other industries and things like that. At least that seems to be like the hope, right?
Yeah, and like, thank you, Dan. I'm not someone who has any like formal education in labor relations. I just am a huge nerd who has read a lot of theory because I like to read theory. And something we try and do in Hollywood Labor is we try and like sneak political education into all of our events in some small ways, because we don't think that labor issues, these are things that affect all of us. You shouldn't have to read pages and pages of theory in order to understand that you deserve to be paid more, you deserve more free time to yourself. And we have a lot of leftists who join who just don't know basic terms like capital. And like it's not something to make fun of people for. It is a result of an effective educational program that does not teach people about labor terms, does not teach people about the economy. I mean, I don't know. I could go on and on about this. How in my high school education, at least, we had one semester of economics class, and it wasn't practical. It was just about, these are some economic terms. Didn't teach us about capital, didn't teach us about anything. I never learned about Taft-Hartley in school, and it is something that has come up every single day this past month in my conversations. I don't know. I think it's an intentional effort to keep people in the dark about things that really affect them.
I think you'd be smart to recognize that pattern in a lot of society, that people are just, you just gloss over these things. Things are seen as not important because knowledge is a form of power. And if people knew about these things, and like they'd be able to put a language to what is they're feeling already and what they're upset about, and then they can become that much closer to feeling empowered to solve something, so to solve like their conditions. And that empowerment, I think, is what people are afraid of. And I like that you're leading the charge of making people in power afraid. So thank you very much, Helen, for joining me.
Thank you, Dan. This has been a pleasure.